Hello, I'm Julia George, and this is the Sunday Politics in the South East. Coming up later, it's one thing all the parties seem to agree on: more houses should be built. So could the Garden City be the answer to the housing needs of the South East? With me in the studio today are Amber Rudd, Conservative MP for Hastings and Rye, and Simon Thompson, who's been selected by the Labour Party to stand in Dartford at the general election. Lovely to have you both with us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. So we've got phones and homes on the show this week. Let's add holidays. Is it ever OK to take a family holiday in term time? The government's very clear on the issue and has put measures in place that allow parents to be fined. This week, figures obtained by BBC South East show that in Kent alone, councils have raised more than £200,000 from families who took their children out of school. Once upon a time, it was all about head teachers' discretion. We're in an era now, Amber Rudd, we've got head teachers more autonomy. You know that because you're the director of a trust that runs 2 academies in Hastings. Schools can set their own term dates, they can set their own hours. What was wrong with head teachers having the discretion when it comes to a child being out of school?
Well, head teachers still have a certain amount of discretion. They can do exceptional circumstances, but what we've said now is that you don't have 10 days to use, which some parents thought was kind of like my 10 days to use. And I think that's absolutely right. The reason it's so important is that truancy is so closely linked to performance.
Yes, but we're not talking about truancy, we're talking about a holiday.
Well, it adds up to the same thing.
It's not the same thing at all. That's ridiculous.
It is the same thing as far as the child is concerned. If a child is missing lessons, they're falling behind other children. If you have children who miss 10 to 20%...
You genuinely are telling me that the same thing applies, that families who take a holiday and may well put plans in place that the child is educated are as bad as parents who systematically allow a child to go
I'm not comparing one
school.
parent to another like that. What I'm saying is that any children who miss school are being disadvantaged for their future life. Nothing is more important in terms of academic achievement than the children's record for attending school.
So you never took your children at any point out of school for even a day?
I don't think I did ever take them on holiday during a term time, no.
Well, there are parents who are being fined for a day or two.
Well, you shouldn't take your children out of school. I mean, Julie, you've either got to be clear about this or not. Does it matter getting your children to school during lesson time or not? It's not a compromise. Getting the children to the lesson on time is important.
Simon,
starting the day and not going during term time.
Nearly 4,500 fines issued across Kent and East Sussex. It's clearly not working, whatever Amber Rudd says. Parents get fined, they go on holiday anyway. It just causes bad feeling between the school and the parents, doesn't it?
Absolutely, and you heard what Amber Rudd said there. It was that basically what she's saying is that it's the same thing. Well, it's not the same thing. Forced absence through whatever situations parents might find themselves in. We had a case recently, of course, I think in Buckinghamshire, where the couple could not find the holiday time or weren't allowed from their employers to take time during school holidays. So they had no other option and were fined heavily for it. What we have to tackle is proper truancy. That's when there's an issue with a social problem at the home that has to be tackled, and the way to do that is through the school, through teachers, through welfare officers, which of course the government have cut down on funding for. It's not penalising those parents. There has to be a set who are taking their children out of school holidays.
Relatively slack attitude there. The fact is, parents have a responsibility to get their children to school for the school day. You can't just say we're going on holiday, and the head teachers have the right to make a decision separately if they want to, but the fact is they don't.
We will cut head
teachers. They want them in the school. They have it for exceptional circumstances.
Well, they're not using it, and why they're not using it? Because it's been taken away by Michael Gove.
No, the fact is they have that. They can do it if they want to, but we've made it more difficult.
That clear message to the
they're clear.
OK, we're going to... Let's see if you've got...
They should be fined if they miss school.
Simon, Amber, let's see if you've got similar difference of opinion on our next subject. Just as important to lots of people, last week Culture Secretary Maria Miller announced an extra £10 million of funding as part of the government's drive to extend broadband to hard-to-reach rural areas. There is no denying the importance of super-fast connectivity to people who live in the countryside. But what about a rather older technology? The mobile phone. Crucial to many companies, our reporter Sarah Neville has been speaking to businesses and campaigners who aren't happy with their signal.
Back in the 80s, mobile phones were more of an accessory than a necessity, but today they're a vital business tool.
Communication let me down, and I'm left here.
Now millions of us are doing business via a mobile, often on the move. But a recent survey of over 400 companies in the South East found that 84% had suffered from so-called mobile cold spots. Some of them claiming it had cost their companies up to £10,000 a year. Hi Lil, it's Mandy.
Sorry? Sorry.
Can you hear me?
Mandy Brooke runs a global recruitment company near Hastings. The firm's set to double in size in the next 18 months. Her phone is her business, but she says local network coverage is a constant issue. So much so, she's thinking of relocating the company.
I think if I'm out in a day, I may spend a good hour of my day not being able to get coverage. And that's quite serious for me because my time is worth a lot of money. You know, if I was to quantify it, it's a significant amount per hour. Just my time, let alone the poor candidates or clients that are trying to get hold of you.
The survey by the South East Local Enterprise Partnership found swathes of rural Kent and East Sussex where mobile phone signals reportedly dropped out or calls failed, including A roads around places like Canterbury, Sheppey, Crowborough and the coast road between Dover and Deal.
And this is another notorious not spot, the A27 near Lewes. It's roads like this that could be benefiting from the government's £150 million scheme aimed at improving coverage. Initially, that promised to help 6 million homes in rural areas. Now it's been scaled back to reach just 60,000 premises and some sections of A roads. By the government's own admission, that's a sizable reduction.
The nationwide project should be completed by the end of next March. But so far, there's only an open-ended pledge for limited provision in the South East. The Countryside Alliance is campaigning on the issue. It says the government has overpromised and under-delivered.
They have obviously scaled back the project due to funding, and 60,000 is not as many as 6 million, but we really need to make sure that they adhere to the 60,000. Each business is as important to the rural economy. They need their mobile signals to be able to work and live. Individual farmers, individual people that are running businesses have to have that signal.
While the government, through the Mobile Infrastructure Project, funds the new masts, it's the mobile phone companies that operate them. In the past, the industry has pointed the finger at local authority planners, claiming it's difficult to get permission for new masts. Council leaders deny that.
I know that's not true. It used to be quite difficult and there used to be lots of protest groups. It is much, much easier to put up, masts. And actually we've also encouraged, and a lot of the companies are doing it, where they're sharing masts. And I think that's a really good idea. So I really don't believe that planning is an impediment.
Back in Hastings, Mandy Brooke thinks the government is forgetting the needs of out-of-town operations.
Everyone's being forced out of the towns, and because of that, they need to be held responsible. They've got to think about what they're doing. If we're coming out of a serious recession, if they want us to grow, then they've got to think about connectivity across the board.
No one can deny the importance of technology like super-fast broadband to the UK economy. But what many rural businesses in the South East want to know is, has the government lost sight of the importance of a basic mobile phone signal?
I'm joined now by John Cook of the Mobile Operators Association. He's in our studio in Aberdeen. John Cook, is there much hope for businesswomen like Mandy Brooks in our film, or will she just have to accept the limitations of the mobile signal in her area?
Hello there, Julia. I think the first thing to say is that any discussion about mobile coverage needs to take into account the fact that in order to have a mobile signal, we need a network of masts. And if you haven't got a network of masts in place, you won't get a signal.
Yeah, I think we grasped that from the film, but she hasn't got a good signal, therefore there probably isn't a mast near to her. Does she just need to accept that, or will that change? Are you going to put masts up in places like that?
The good news is things are getting better. And can I also say that the comments from Mandy and also the comments from the Countryside Alliance about the economic importance of mobile coverage, we completely agree with. And actually the operators are very keen to try and help people like Mandy.
Explain to me what exactly a not spot is, or a cold spot. Is it somewhere you just, as an industry, haven't got round to erecting a mast yet, or is it somewhere where the topography means it's almost impossible?
It's a bit of both. The basic problem with rural areas is that it's almost invariably the case that it's much more expensive to put infrastructure there, to put a mast there. And that's one part of the problem. The other part of the problem is that because they are sparsely populated, you get fewer people using their mobile devices, so the revenue generated from that mast is less. And across the UK as a whole, and I think much of Kent and Sussex would be the same, in rural areas, most of the masts actually, the operating cost exceeds the revenue
But the
that they
government's
generate.
putting money into this. The government's putting money into it, and yet there's been no application, as we understand it, for any new mobile phone signals in the Battle area where Mandy is since 2010. So when are things going to improve for her?
OK, well, there are in terms of Mandy, if she's in Battle, I should say I've got some sympathy because I know what the signal is like in Battle. I think it's pretty much the same across all the networks. I know if you're on the A21, slap bang in the middle of Battle, you've got a signal, but if you're a few hundred yards in any direction, I know it starts
your
to get a
sympathy,
bit
I'm sure, is
iffy.
welcome, but are things going to change for her?
Well, I'll say the good news is I can't comment on the specifics of Battle on a specific network. What I can say is that that is exactly the sort of area where I'd anticipate things getting better in the not-too-distant future.
John, thank you very much. We must leave it there. I want to bring our other guests in, but thank you so much for being there for us. John Cook there. It doesn't really sound like Mandy's got much hope here. Amber, what would your advice be? Mandy Brooks, I think you know her, actually.
Yes, I do know her. She runs a very successful business. But I think
maybe she should move her business to somewhere she can get a mobile phone
must have been
signal.
hearing a different answer from your interviewer a moment ago, because he said the good news is Battle's exactly the sort of place that we would expect a mast to be put up. The fact is the government's put in £150 million into this. The first masts were installed at the end of last year, which was ahead of schedule. So I think it's a bit too early to write off this project. It's a long way to go, and I think it's going to deliver a great result in the area for Mandy and other businesses.
OK, the government's promises have shrunk enormously from improving signals for 6 million people, and that was a pledge made by George Osborne in 2011 to 60,000 households. It's an awful lot of people who are going to get left out, and there are no detailed plans for the South East. I mean, I heard the same answer as you, and I got the impression that that was wishful thinking, frankly, because we've talked to the local council. There are no applications pending for a mast in her area.
It's only just started. We've had the first ones been installed at the end of last year.
So if you've got good news, are you going to tell me that there are plans?
Well, actually, I'm not working in the mobile network operator, but fortunately this interviewer seems to be, and he tells us it's a good place and there will be applications soon. So I think from the expert point of view, it sounds very encouraging.
It was the sort of place where there might be improvements in the future.
And the first ones came last year.
I think you're hanging on to threads a little bit.
I think you're dismissing it too early.
Simon, you're a former local journalist. You probably remember, like I do, how people used to object to mobile phone masts. You probably went on the same stories I did, all the scare stories. Times have changed. People would rather have a mast now than not have one, wouldn't they?
I think there are still some concerns in some quarters about the impact of mobile phone masts, but we've got to now support our communities to actually invest and get those mobile phone masts up there in the villages. I know, for instance, in Amber Rudd's own constituency, in places like Fairlight, there is poor coverage still. How can you encourage small businesses to grow when they can't even get a mobile phone coverage in their own village using their own phone?
What did you hear John Cook say?
I thought that he was saying that there's going to still be a problem for some time to come. The problem is the government's behind with its schedule. It's 2 years behind. It's 2 years. There are 2 years delays. You've mucked up 4G coverage. Actually, the government needs to get to grips with the mobile phone companies. Needs to say we need to have universality coverage, and that's the must.
Ofcom are playing a role. We have to take into consideration the fact that taxpayers' money is considered here. Now, I know that's not very fashionable for Labour people, but the fact is we have to make sure the money is spent economically as well.
Of course,
it is taxpayers' money.
Take some of that money that's earmarked at the moment for the cities, for high-speed development in the cities, actually to pay it and put it into the rural broadband needs in some of the
No point in robbing Peter to pay Paul. We can do it with what we've got, and I just think it's too early.
That's
not true. We've had the first one have come at the end of last year ahead of schedule. It's too early to say this is a disaster.
You've got until March next year.
Yes.
You're never going to agree.
And I'm really looking forward to coming back in March next year and telling you the good news.
You're on. We'll have you back on that. Thank you very much indeed. Now, it's one of the things most of our politicians agree on. I'm not so sure these two will. They don't agree on much. We need to build more houses, particularly in the South East where demand's so high. But how to do this, and crucially where, well, that's rather more divisive. Last week, the Deputy Prime Minister, Nick Clegg, said that David Cameron must be honest and upfront about government plans to build 2 new garden cities. One could be in Kent. Well, it's an old concept. Here's Kate Ford with a little history lesson.
Garden cities sprang from the late Victorian arts and crafts movement, a reaction to the sprawling urban squalor of industrialism by returning to nature. Ebenezer Howard had a vision of utopian, self-sufficient communities for whom the natural landscape was complemented by spacious, well-planned settlement. His designs were pioneered at Letchworth and Welwyn in Hertfordshire.
I'm standing at the heart, at the birthplace, if you like, of Milton Keynes, Britain's newest city.
And so the Garden Cities concept evolved, as soon came the new towns like Milton Keynes and Stevenage, which sought to relieve the cities of their expanding populations, as well as relocating those whose homes were bombed during World War II. These were social projects as much as they were building projects, aimed at changing lifestyle as well as housing provision. So whether or not a modern garden city would conform to Ebenezer Howard's radical original vision remains to be seen. But could a modern version of this 20th century idea be the answer to the housing needs of today?
Well, let's find out the answer to that question, shall we? Joining us now from our studio in London is Ricky Burdett. He's a expert in urban planning at the London School of Economics. Professor Burdett, thank you for joining us. Let's answer that question. Could new cities, in particular garden cities, be the answer to the housing crisis?
I think any form of new development is something we need to look at, because we can't keep it the way it is. But we can't look back at something that worked 100 years ago and think it's the solution today. I mean, if you think of what those garden cities were about, were exactly to get away from congestion, pollution, overcrowding of the industrial city. That's not the problem we have today. Today we actually have a lot of extra space, even in London, if you think of the Thames Gateway. So I think we've got to be innovative, but why go and build new stuff out there on the edges of the city when we've got so much more opportunity still close to hand?
Why is everyone frightened of building in the countryside? There's heaps of land in the southeast, and it can't all be Grade 1 agricultural land.
I think the reason is very simple, which is to do, compared to, say, 100 years ago, is an understanding of sustainability and the environment. I think everyone understands that if you reduce the need for people to sit in a car and commute maybe half an hour a day, and can actually maybe walk or take public transport to go to work, to school, to university, to hospital, that must be a good thing. So given, and this is the key point, given that there is a lot of space left in some of our cities, particularly in the southeast, why go and encroach on the countryside, which is going to take valuable land away from nature, when we can use a lot of the brownfield land, which is waiting for us.
But if you use the brownfield sites and if you infill, you add to the existing towns and cities, doesn't that just cause congestion on existing roads, more competition for school places, more competition for doctors' appointments?
Well, that's when planning comes into it. We've all learned that we need to plan our cities well. I think there is absolutely no real sense today that there is overcrowding on the streets, or particularly the non-central parts of places like London or all the other cities in the southeast. That is not the problem. The real issue is that if you start putting people way out on the edges on their own, not only do you not even have access to hospitals because there are no hospitals there, you don't have access to public transport because there is no public transport there, you actually run the risk of creating ghettos of communities which are cut out on their own, and all they are homes. You might solve the house crisis, in other words, a shell with a building, but you don't create a community where families and others will want to live there for 20, 30, 40, 50 years. That's the key issue. It's community, not houses.
Sorry to interrupt you. Thank you very much. Some interesting points that we can put to the politicians in the studio. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
The politicians have got it wrong, Simon. Turns out, if you ask an expert, the last thing we should be doing is building new cities. And yet this is what Ed Miliband promised in his most recent conference speech, a generation of garden cities and new towns. Has he got it wrong?
No, he hasn't. What the professor made is a very good point, is that we first of all should be looking at filling in our brownfield sites. Brownfield first. The government did away with that commitment when they came into office in 2010. Ed Miliband has made that commitment of 200,000 houses, 200,000 new homes being built by 2020 per year. We need that. There's a desperate need for housing in this country. I know from speaking to so many people struggling to get on the housing ladder now in Dartford, struggling to even pay rents in Dartford and elsewhere in the southeast. But brownfield sites first. And then we need to make sure the infrastructure is in place. That's most important. Too often, developers are sitting on land, and we need to say to those developers, no, you use it or you lose it. OK,
brownfield sites first isn't going to generate enough. The former president of the RIBA, Jack Pringle, told us that we need around 1 million new homes. Amber Rudd, we need garden cities and new villages and brownfield development, don't we?
I certainly think that the answer is to provide a kind of smorgasbord of different options. And what I thought was so interesting from the professor is that expectations have changed, and there's more awareness about planning, about community, not just about homes, but about community. And I've heard the Secretary of State talk about, Eric Pickles, about garden settlements. So not straight to garden cities, but garden settlements in areas that are kind of half brownfield, half town. You know, there are sort of government-owned sites and council-owned sites that we could can look at that are brownfield, but not necessarily in the middle of cities. I certainly think we should be looking at garden settlements, at brownfield and about new areas. The point is we need a solution that covers all these areas.
But one of the difficulties here is what the local authorities, who are the planning authorities, say. Now, I've spoken to Maidstone Borough Council on BBC Radio Kent. They say there's no way that they're going to endorse, for instance, a new garden city in Yalding. Lots of people will think there's quite a good reason why not. Well, how do you get around that? I mean, I don't know if either of you have got an idea about how you get around the fact that this might be what we need, but it's not what local authorities are going to find it easy to sell to the people who live there.
You've got to work with the local authorities together. So you've got to sit down with a number of local authorities, not just one, and say, here you go, you're presented with a fait accompli, have a new town, have a garden city in Yalding. Completely ridiculous idea on the floodplain. It just makes no sense at all. What you need to do, though, is sit down in a region with a number of local authorities and say, right, let's work out what are the incentives, what do you need, what sort of infrastructure do you need, and then you start planning. We have a lack of joined-up planning in this country, and we need to get to grips with it.
But, Amber Rudd, I just want to pick up on this thought about what people think in this country. I mean, the professor said, you know, there's no overcrowding, but I will tell you, people will phone into a radio show and tell you over and over again, we are full. Now, until politicians are really honest and say that that's not true, that we need to change that narrative, you're never going to persuade people to accept new developments,
Well, I think that to a certain extent you're right. We've got to change the narrative. We've got to explain to people why it's needed. It's needed not just, you know, it's not necessarily about immigration. What it's about is families. It's about children. Where are those people's children going to live if we don't build new houses? And I would give you as an example, we've got the Hastings to Bexhill Link Road, which is currently being built, and that's going to provide a site on the side of Bexhill, which is going to be for 2,000 new homes. And that was planning permission that was granted. So local authorities will work with you sometimes.
We will definitely be talking about housing again. Right, it's time now for a quick roundup. The other events this week, here's James Fitzgerald.
No fracking in Bolcombe is the promise of energy firm Quadrilla. Protesters there are concerned the company is still planning other means of oil extraction. In Margate, a man's been charged with assaulting Nigel Farage. The UKIP leader was hit over the head during this fracas with a placard. 28,000 homes were left without power in Kent during recent storms. Pulled before the Energy Select Committee, energy bosses were accused of a complacent response.
You displayed a neglect for your customers, which I personally find absolutely astonishing. But thank you all for coming in.
Meanwhile, a Kent County Council report has admitted that although its response to the storms was first class, it still needs a better flood plan. Making his own weather forecast, MP Simon Kirby responded to a UKIP councillor who blamed the storms on legalised same-sex marriage by saying the future's bright for his city's gay community.
The weather in Brighton is nearly always very sunny.
It would only be fair if Brighton Kemp Town was actually put in place on the shipping forecast.
That's it for this week. My thanks to our guests Simon Thompson and Amber Rudd.